So the summer anime season is officially in full swing, and with it brings a bunch of new shows, and of course you know it, a bunch of new isekai. And honestly, I'm one of those people that used to be like maybe 1 out of 5 isekai that came out I was like a big fan of, but the past few years, I honestly think like 2 out of 3 that I try, I end up enjoying at the very least, and sometimes I honestly think are absolutely fantastic. And watching 2 episodes of My Isekai Life, which had me intrigued, but I didn't really know what to expect going in. I saw a bunch of slimes, probably an overpowered character, but I was honestly expecting that this show was going to be a lot more lonely is how I'd put it. And what I mean is, you'd have a main character who might be enjoyable, but his slimes weren't going to talk, and he probably wouldn't have a lot of characters around him. I thought it was going to be a lot more like lone wanderer in the woods, maybe picks up some quests, things like that. But what I actually ended up getting was something full of personality and really fun dynamics. I both love the idea of what this isekai is going for, but I especially like the individual interactions, whether it's the dozens and dozens of slimes that do talk and all have their own unique personality, even if they do kind of feel like a hive mind, basically like a collective personality that he uses and controls as weapons. But they all seemingly have individual names if my anime list is anything to go off of, which, you know, I ain't gonna remember all the different slimes, but I do appreciate that they visually have their own little kind of quirks and characteristics in terms of visual differences. But the fact that there's so many human interactions, even though you can look at the main character Yuji, who's been a part of this world, he announces for a week in episode 2. The man's already this overpowered within a week. I can only begin to imagine how powerful he'd be by the time he reaches the end of this story. He'd probably ascend to godhood, I'm going to bet. But ultimately, I like the fact that, for being an overpowered story, I like the fact that you see all the different characters and how they respond to these situations. I actually got some Overlord vibes with how he was building up the saving moment at the end of episode 1 in terms of, yes, you know, a character like Ainz, or in the case of this, a character like Yuji can probably one-shot all these people. But I like how he used all the different pieces at play to, one, kind of cover his identity, but also make sure that they weren't mindlessly dying for something they didn't need to. So the idea of essentially letting them kind of be the first force that pushes back this army of monsters that's coming, as he's using all these different spells, which he shouldn't be able to use because he's just a simple monster tamer, but as seen in the second episode, the idea of reading books in these like magic tomes, you learn the abilities, and because he tamed a bunch of slimes, they read this wizard's kind of like library that made him into a powerful sage. So the fact that he uses all these slimes in interesting ways, first of which he spreads them all around the city, basically puts a giant barrier around them. He tells him he's going to use this dragon bone to burn them to flames. We actually see he uses this demonic hellfire magic ability. First blast didn't do enough, so then he starts draining into his health points and completely annihilates everything around them. I like seeing how it's not just like, okay, we have this very cool demeanor, not too emotional character, which is kind of his persona. He's not a dick and he's not like, you know, no emotions, but he's pretty cool, calm, and collected, and given the brief moments we've got into his backstory of just that kind of like day in, day out Japanese office worker, I love the art style they use to kind of like symbolize we're looking at his original life. Very creative decision. It was really fun to see just how overworked he was and how he doesn't want to be depended on by others because in his original life, he literally had absolutely no free time and was just swamped with work. Granted, he's now an overpowered sage who can control slimes and make them do all his bidding. He's not really going to struggle the same way he did in original Japan, but you understand the bit of skepticism he has for being depended on, which seemingly is why he left the first town and went to the next one. So it kind of feels like the way the story is going to be working, at least this is my hunch anyway, is that if he gets too depended on by different people, he'll move to the next town and probably do some incredible adventuring and then probably just be a wandering tamer. Or maybe this location will be the main hub for this season. I don't know, but it does feel like there will be a personal journey of opening up and probably accepting other people's help and, you know, being relied on. But I think what made these 2 episodes so fun is that it was just a very fun show to follow. You have a talking wolf who was just a meme in itself. There's one moment in episode 2 when they're trying to scare these bandits, these kidnappers, and they basically look like a giant slime blob, but you can't really tell what they are because you see a bunch of eyes and it's just a bunch of shadows, and it turns out it's actually just the wolf carrying all these slimes and he has the most shocked face ever. There's just a lot of really fun, charming things about it, but there's also a pretty deep magic system that we've got a brief taste of, but the more I see of it, the more I like it. The first big taste is when he's standing up on the roof of this giant building as he's protecting the village. You see all these different menus, and he's basically like almost creating spells, or at the very least chaining together a command like you're playing a big tactical video game. So he's saying, okay, this is going to happen, this is going to connect here, chain reaction to this. And the cool thing about it is that he basically acts like someone at the command center. He's commanding all his troops, so all of his magic comes from these slimes that with any other monster tamer literally would be nothing. So it's basically like watching Rimuru, but you have 1,000 of them, and they're just doing these adorable things. They are absolutely adorable. Their little squeaks, their little voices, their just peak adorableness, while also able to burn things to ash without a second glance. And then when it came to the end of episode 2, when they're trying to, because they start a party, and even though in hindsight it was pretty obvious the dude was going to betray them, in the moment I thought they did a good job at making us think he's probably a bad guy, but then immediately started to kind of open up and seem more useful. So I was like, oh, there's two options you typically see. He turns out to be a bad guy, or he turns out to be useless, and then someone like Yuji has to come in and save the day. But it kind of felt like the party was working quite well, and then it turns out he's been behind a bunch of adventurers going missing, because he takes a party and then they so-called run away, but really they end up kidnapped and probably forced into slavery. And then to see how he used the ice blast to just freeze everyone, it was just really cool to see how it has everything you kind of expect, probably hit by a train, hit by a car, ended up here, doesn't know where he is, but he's an overpowered character. He has like a basic ability that is nothing, but it turned into something extraordinary. But even if you have the typical elements, it's really about how you execute them. And I think the idea of making it feel chock full of interesting personalities, giving the slimes a voice was a very good idea, especially the fact that they have their own physical differences in terms of just like small visual cues, but it's enough to make it feel like you're not looking at the same thing for too long. And the fact that he actually interacts with all these different people. Yes, he can essentially deal with any obstacle as it stands, but the fact that it doesn't feel like the general people can, and how he utilizes them to keep them safe but also save the day as he doesn't want to be relied on, is a pretty interesting story hook as they set in motion that there's some doomsday approaching with some baddies probably up to no good that will probably make him work for it a lot more than he had to up until this point over his first week in this new world that has really turned him into an OP badass. I know with these types of shows, anytime you have a character who's not the most like gun-ho, super charismatic character, you can get a lot of people saying that they're boring and blah blah blah. For me, that only really works as an argument if there's no personality surrounding the more neutral character, and the fact that there is personality makes it a very charming watch, and I'm really excited. I have to admit, I walked into this one thinking it might be an okay watch, and maybe a solid one at best, but I have to say, I'm eager for episode 3, and based on the countdowns on stuff like Live Chart, it does seem like episode 3 will be airing next week, so it's not one of those, we got an extra episode, so we have to wait a couple of weeks for the next one. It does seem like episode 3 will be airing next week, and I'm excited for more, but thoughts if you have any down below. What did you think on either episode 1 or 2, and are you going to be checking out episode 3 when it does come out? Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you're new around here. Until next time, everyone, please take care and have a good one.